We'll start just for 2 more speakers, and after we'll have a longer lunch break. So I would like just to begin with something that Louisa said in the end, that the Smithsons' ideas are mostly non-visual, and also that identity is to come from patterns of use and not from design. And also I'll add a quote by the Smithsons, where they say that it is hard to retain in the mind, they're talking about the building, elusive, except when one is actually there. Then it seems perfectly simple. So we hope that the last 2 speakers of this morning, 2 extraordinary clients with 2 extraordinary commissions, will give us some clues of this linking of visual with the physical. First, I would like to introduce Derek Sugden, who is not an architect. He's, as he repeatedly said since yesterday, he's a structural engineer and acoustician, and joined the Arabs in 1953, and again he repeatedly said it's 50 years ago. And he founded the Arabs Acoustics in 1980, and actually he chaired the Arabs Associates between 84 and 87 before he retired. And I would like to say that Derek Sugden was responsible for leading the design of Snape Moulding's concert hall with conductor Benjamin Britten. And till today, I would say, Snape is still heralded as one of the finest concert halls in the world. And of course, his talk is entitled The Sugden House. And the second speaker, and last, will conclude the morning, is Niall Hobhouse, an art dealer, and he's also involved in the Cities program at the London School of Economics. One thing I can say is that when I read the piece he wrote for The Independent after Peter Smithson died, I was struck by 2 things. The one is that he described the commission as a small but pressing domestic architectural problem, and the second is that the building remains a work in progress, and that was his final phrase. And not by chance is his talk entitled Like Asking Matisse for Advice on Repainting the Dining Room. Please welcome Derek Sugden.
Once again, thank you for inviting me. I've looked round, but I haven't seen many engineers here, which is rather sad. Before I talk about the house, I thought I'd just say a few words about how I managed to finish up in Arabs in '53. I'd had 2 jobs before then, and if I hadn't joined Arabs, I would never have met the Smithsons and had the joy and interest and stimulation of that relationship. As I say, I'd had 2 jobs. I worked first of all for a steelwork contractor for some years, and then I was a resident engineer for a small consultant in the docks, where I met one of the most gifted engineers I ever worked with, Ronald Hobbs, who joined Arabs before me and was always trying to persuade me to join. But I always kept telling him it was far too intellectual for me, because it was full of people who had no problems in solving 8th order partial differential equations, and I was not very good at that. But eventually I was fixed, and I was interviewed by another Ronald, called Ronald Jenkins, and the conversation with him didn't get very far, because he started questioning me on my knowledge of matrices, and I thought he was talking about beds. Because he pronounced it matrices, you see, in a rather flat A. Because the interview was so unsuccessful, they decided I should be interviewed by Arup himself. And that was even more demoralizing, I might say, because the first thing he did was to confuse me with somebody else. Then he discovered that I was the one who'd been introduced by what he called Bob Hobbs. I said, no, it's Ron Hobbs, Ronald Hobbs. He said, well, we can't have two Ronalds, so he's called Bob. And he was very cross with me to start with. Then he said, what shall I ask you? So I said, well, you could ask me if I'm a qualified structural engineer. He said, are you? I said, yes. and then he said, what else shall I ask you? Well, you can ask me what I've done. So I told him what I'd done. And he said, you've spent an awful lot on sites. Not that I don't think that's important, but can you design things? If you see an architect, meet an architect, or see his drawings, can you design things? I said, well, I haven't had much experience at that. And all the architects I've met, I found rather, well, I think I'll leave that to one side. And then he suddenly said to me, are you intelligent? Well, of course, you can't answer that. And he knew I couldn't. And then he said, oh, that's a bloody silly question, isn't it? And I agreed with him. And that really was the end of the interview, apart from the fact we found we both had an interest in, particularly in Baroque music. And I was surprised, and they actually offered me a job. But just, one little anecdote I've forgotten is just before we left, he said, oh, how much do you want? And I was earning $7.20 a year. And as I had been sort of fixed by Hobbs to come for these interviews, I said, I want $7.50 a year. He nearly fell off his chair. And he said, ooh, that's an awful lot of money. And I discovered afterwards that only Zuntz and Hobbs were being paid that amount. Anyway, they offered me a job for $7.20, so I started on June the 1st, 53. And one of the first persons I met was Peter, because Hobbs' group were working on his entry for the Coventry Cathedral competition, and they had just completed Hunstanton. And Hunstanton fascinated me. Although I was an engineer, I'd long had a love affair with Mies van der Rohe. And I found Hunstanton absolutely mind-blowing. And in addition, they had also done something quite different in a different category, Bryn Mawr. And both of those jobs I found deeply attractive, and Ronald Jenkins had engineered them both. Can I start with the slides, please? Well, you've all seen that, and I, as working for a contractor and consultant before, what amazed me about it, even on the industrial jobs I had worked on, often without the benefit of architects and architecture, I knew about Braithwaite tanks, but they were looked upon as so ugly, even on an industrial job they were covered up. But here these Braithwaite tanks were stuck up as a great emblem and celebrated. The other great thing was that Ronald Jenkins and Hobbs had, for the first time in the world, designed the frame on the plastic theory, and it was the first time the plastic theory had been used for more than one story. And of course Ronald Jenkins was very, very special, and so was Hobbs. In fact, I think I'd make them the two most gifted engineers I've ever worked with, who had that ability to be not just in analysis, but in design. You'll find most engineers are good at one and good at the other, but not very good at both. But both Hobbs and Jenkins had that sort of vision and that mathematical ability to do both. So there it is. And it was site welded, and I had done a lot of welding in my youth, so I was very impressed. It was sight welded, the double frames were sight welded and lifted by crane. And Bryn Mawr, and Ronald Jenkins is the second on the left. And why there's another connection, I remember a CNCA conference in July 1952. Not many of you would have been there, but Peter was there, and these are the words he used about Bryn Mawr. He said, "One imagines Bryn Mawr after 1,000 years having the structural dignity of the ruined baths of Caracalla." Now, that's a marvellous observation, and sadly it's not there. And Peter was absolutely right, but he's a factor of 20 out. After 50 years, it looked like the ruins of Caracalla. But it wasn't in the sort of place where they would put Aida on. So, that was Ronald Jenkins. Now, Ronald, as I said, was very special. Not only did he push the boundaries of designing shell roofs, but statically indeterminate structures especially. Engineers have very special categories. Statically determinate, statically indeterminate structures. And that's the way you go about things in totally different ways. And of course, statically indeterminate structures had all been designed by using the classical equations of strain energy, which you architects should have all been taught at your colleges. But he actually introduced the use of matrices, which I'd already mentioned, to the solution of indeterminate structures. And Ronald developed a great friendship with Alison and Peter Smithson. And there was an empathy there because he thought in a way, I think, sometimes that Peter did, and he wrote in a much more elegant way than any other engineer I know. And I'll quote just a little bit, which I think is one of the finest bits of English trying to explain the mysteries of mathematics from one of his slim volumes on thin cylindrical shell roofs. I hope you understand it. "When matrices are used, we obtain the symmetric form as a geometrical consequence without appeal to the conception of work, which is merely the name of a scalar invariant associated with contragradient sets." Isn't that wonderful? I've got another forward. Oh, and that's Ronald, a better photograph. And that's Ron Hobbs, when I met him on the site down in the docks. And he was, who ran the group, who worked on all of Smithson's jobs, and again became a great friend of Smithson. And so, how did it come about that I invited, or Peter invited himself, to design our house? In Hobbs' group, Peter came in one evening with a job which was a plywood-clad steel frame house which he was going to design for the director of Luxfer, who had done the glazing on Hunstanton. And because of my steelwork background, I got involved, not only in the design, but in the shop details. Sadly, it never went ahead. But I was discussing some of these shop details late one evening, and I had just bought a piece of land in, of all places, Watford. And I, being an arrogant young engineer and having been involved in design of factories and sheds, felt, well, I'll design my own house. That's a pushover. And after 6 weeks of hard work, I decided it was impossible. Later on, I'm rather a Wittgenstein man. I read all about his problems of designing his sister's house in Vienna. So I decided I must find an architect. And I explained this terrible problem to Peter, and I said, you see, you've got to find me a young, brilliant architect who can design me not a contemporary house. I want an ordinary house. I didn't know Peter was into ordinariness then. Ordinary but radical, ordinary but radical I wanted, and I want this architect to be so good, he'll supervise the job well, he'll get it finished on time and on price, and I can't afford more than 2,500. And Peter said, I'd love to do it. And I remember saying, oh, but you're famous. I'm sure I said that, but you're famous. He said, it doesn't matter, we only charge the trades union rate, you know. In other words, they only charge the RIBA scales. So off we went. And one of the most interesting things was that Alison worked on it for about 2 weeks and sent us the sketches. And I looked at these in great detail and did a written critique. And we went to Limerston Street for the day, and I always remember it because it was already family, because Alison was at her drawing board, Peter sitting at the table, and Simon, a little baby, was in a hammock under the drawing board. And I think Simon somewhere said he became an architect because it was in his genes. But I'm basically a geneticist, but I think the environment did have something to do with it. The swinging hammock under the drawing board. Anyway, we went through this critique, and I was certainly not very happy with the butterfly roof. I hated internal gutters, and it had very narrow slit windows. And Alison told us it was like, who's that castle in... yes, I've forgotten the name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And Jean's mother used to spend odd weekends with us and had very poor sight. And Jean was a gardener and wanted a house which was exposed to a garden. And anyway, the modern movement had sold us big windows. But I did a foolish thing then. After going through the critique, I said to Alison, actually, we don't like it very much. And Alison was very cross. In a nice sort of way, but there was no doubt about it. She was very cross indeed. And Peter, in his lovely way, swept up the drawings and said something like, of course this is over, a long while ago. He said, if we can't design something for the Sugdens, we may as well pack up now. I'll have a go. And a fortnight later, the plan was the same. It was turned round, and he got rid of the valley gutter, and there was the house. And that's the approach to the house up the drive. And you can see now that the garden Jean, my wife, developed and planned has grown. And when you come in, that's the entrance door. And if you look back, you get another view of that garden, which is mainly trees and shrubs. And Peter and Alison did the geometry of the terrace, and that we've maintained. We couldn't afford to do it in brick at that time, but Peter was happy that we did it in 6-foot squares of concrete with grass in between. And you go into the house there, and that's the entry to the house. And I remember Ed Jones saying to me, what's lovely about your house, you see it all straight away. And I always remember that because I had one of those conversations with Alison and Peter about as found in that position. It was just about finished. And Peter, Jean wasn't there. I'd gone to a site meeting and I'd met them. We'd been round everything. And Peter stood with his back to the post of the end of the staircase, and Alison just to his right. And Peter started rubbing his face. And I always knew when he rubbed his face in his own particular way, he was going to ask me something or suggest something that I probably wouldn't agree with. And he said, we've been thinking about the timber. We'd already increased the cost of the house. Our agreement do it all in Colombian pine. We think we'd like to dye some of the timber purple and green. And there was a long pause, and I said, I don't like that idea very much at all. What about, I mean, I've been reading your stuff, you've been teaching me for months, and if not a year or two, about things. What about materials as found? And Alison looked up at me and said, oh, Derek, that's absolutely passé. So I thought, the wonderful thing about working with architects is they have totally put aside what I call Aristotelian logic. And I said, perhaps foolishly to Alison, I said, that's not an argument. You know, thesis, antithesis. I always thought she was a good Hegelian. At synthesis, that's not an argument. That's just a, observation. Not convincing at all. And Peter said, I think Derek's right. And of course, I left then and left them both to it, which I think was the wisest move I made. Anyway, that little incident took place there. And you go in, turn right, and there's the living room, and you see the kitchen beyond, and through the opening where we have this reinforced concrete beam, the living space. If you go on and look back, you can see the border on the other side of the road that Jean has developed. And if you go into the kitchen, you can still look right through, and you see that Eames chair there. That's one of my favourite spots. Since Jean had a stroke, I do the cooking, and I tend to have some red wine to help me on my way, or a very, very strong Tommy Lehrer gin and tonic. And I sit on that chair and look out at Jean's garden, and it's wonderful. In fact, there are lots of fabulous spots all over the house where you can just sit and enjoy. And that's the kitchen. And the playroom used to be through there. And the boiler, the purple boiler, was just on the left. But as we got older, we couldn't hump the anthracite into it. So we've taken that boiler out and got a gas-fired boiler which we put in the yard. But that playroom then became my eldest son's bedsit, then Jean's study. Then when I finally retired from Arabs, it became my study. We had a sort of, Jean and I had a day's discussion about that. And she moved upstairs into the small bedroom. And that's, can you sharpen that just a bit, I think? And that's the living room. And another little discussion, because the dressing of the building, which Louise talked about, you see, again, the inconsistency of architects. When we moved in, Alison and Peter came, had a light lunch with us, and Alison and Jean got on very well indeed. And Alison walked down, she said, we think all the curtains should be white. And we'd already got 2 sticky-fingered kids by then, and possibly more on the way. And Jean said, oh, think of the washing, Alison. Well, and then Peter said, you see, those books weren't up there by then, but there were a bookcase this side designed by Alison, which was already full of books. He said, well, Derek, he said, you've got all that coloured bookscape. And in addition, you will walk around the house in those red shirts. So I said, not only dressing the house, I suddenly felt these architects wanted to dress me. And there's going into the living space. That's looking back at that fitment. Well, Alison designed all these fitments, which we haven't changed at all. They're black outlines with a slate grey paint. Loliondo floor over the Benham's floor heating, which has been extremely successful and still works beautifully today. And the black and white tiles, which lasted for 30 years. We only replaced them after 30 years. and that's looking at the fireplace. That's now one alteration we made. Our boys' bedroom was on, as you go up the staircase, on the right, and it was open with just a balustrade and a curtain, and it was spatially and architecturally absolutely delightful. But the noise penetration was too much, so we closed it in. But if anybody wants to do a complete restoration, the Smithson detailing is still behind the T and G, so you can just take the T and G off, and it's there. And that's looking down the staircase, and that's one of my favourite views too, coming out of our bathroom, looking down the staircase into the third bedroom on the left, which you can't see in this photograph, and then into Jean and my bedroom on the right. Ah, that slide's not right. That's a pity. That's the step up to the raised level of the two front bedrooms. Let it go. Wonder if I do it back, it'll... Ah. No. That's the bedroom. And the second, and the visitor's bedroom. And back down to the kitchen. So I thought I'd take you out on the north side, through the yard, the back of the house, and the view of the garden from that side. And Jean's garden is now getting on, and that's a close-up at the front. Jean, I think that's Jean leaning out of the window. And that's the little statue we commissioned, and you can see the house from the bottom of the garden. And there, close up of the statue. And the road. And another view of the lower part of the garden. Working with architects. I work with architects now. I started work in 41, met my first architect professionally in 41. And despite my close contact with them, particularly in Arab Associates, they continuously surprise me. And that's lovely in a way. They continuously surprise me. And they come up with things suddenly out of the blue. And just before we finished, Peter came with this drawing and said, we'd like to paint the opening windows a different colour. And this is his own drawing of the different colours. It's not, and you can see all the opening lights are painted different colours. The painting subcontractor couldn't bear that, of course, getting all these little cans out and stirring them all up. And I'm afraid that we're keeping this record, but since we painted it, we've painted it all white. So that's it, really, except to say, Jean asked me to say she loves the house, it's a joy to live in, and the garden, the house, and the two occupants are slowly maturing to moving into decay. Thank you for listening to me.
We're going to turn the lights on in a minute, and you can. I have a few slides to show you. by a strange chance, Derek's house is always the early Peter and Alison project that I thought had always most admired, thought was subtlest and in a way representative of Peter and Alison. It's also possible that I, as a kind of private client, related to it much more easily. But I'm very pleased to be kind of the other end of the bracket this morning with my project. Peter built a tower for me in the country in Somerset over the last 4 years, really, which we completed in the summer last year. And I'm not at all going to talk about what I think it meant for him or where it fits in the work. I'm going to try and tell you a very simple story about the process, really, of working with Peter. But I thought that I might just tell you in a kind of unscripted way before I start reading my text that the only completely happy planning story you'll ever hear. I mean, maybe other people have them, but this one works wonderfully well. In the early stages, Peter came down several times, which I'll explain to you, and he was sitting one day having breakfast in the kitchen, and one of the planning officers came to see me about something else, and when I introduced them, I saw her go sort of sheet white. I mean, absolutely sheet white, as though she didn't know what to make of this. And Peter just went on eating his toast, absolutely unmoved. And when we got outside, I said, "Are you all right?" And she said, and this is the origin of that thing, she said, "I've got to get back to the office quickly. I've got to tell them this was like meeting Matisse." And she disappeared. She couldn't concentrate on the project that I wanted to talk to her about. And what I then discovered was that the planning department of the South Somerset District Council had been conducting a covert small war on behalf of modernism for 30 years. I mean, they were struggling with a huge disadvantage, which is that nobody ever asked them to build anything remotely modern. So that, and I think two of them had been taught by Peter and Alison. I mean, so for them it was, incredibly exciting. Peter's only building in England for 20 years or so. They told me I was going to have huge problems with the district council and with the parish council, and it went to the district council meeting, who were a newly elected Tory group who felt, as it turned out, that they had to kind of right a wrong that had been done to me. I'd had an enormous planning battle with the Liberal council, who they succeeded. So what I understood was that the tone of the meeting was, Niall is clearly off his head to want to build this building, but he should be allowed to do what he wants to do in his own on his own property. So it came back sort of stamped and completed, and then went to the parish, who are the kind of parish council who grant permission instantly for any new silage clamp, and make unbelievable difficulties about a conservatory or a window. And they decided, and I wasn't there, but they decided that I had simply thought of a fiendishly clever way of getting a telecommunications tower past the planners. So we had this situation where everybody was pleased. The planners thought they'd struck a blow for modernism. The district council felt that they had struck a blow for civil liberties of their kind of civil liberty. And the parish thought they'd struck a blow against the planners. So anyway, that was sort of the background to the whole thing. I first met Peter 5 years ago, and it was really completely a blind date. I'd agreed to pick him up from the local railway station on a Sunday morning, very cold Sunday morning in April. It wasn't all that difficult because he was literally the only person who got off the train. What had happened before was really, in a way, instructive and salutary for me. A very good friend of his and mine, Nicholas Oldsberg, who's the director of the CCA in Montreal, had persuaded me that that if we could get Peter interested, he was ideal to tackle a really intransigent, small architectural problem, which literally had to do with the location of a kitchen in an 18th century house that I had in the country. Nicholas had seen Peter on one of his visits to London, and I got a message back that the studio they were still at work on a project in Germany, and that, as a matter of principle, Peter didn't want to work on more than one project at a time. Slightly to my shame, I simply took this as the great man having much better things to do than help me with my kitchen, and he'd simply found this very courteous, scrupulously courteous way of rejecting what I was proposing. But then, in November, about 6 months later, I got a message from Canada to say that he was finished in Germany, and that Peter was finished in Germany, and that he was ready to consider whatever it was I had in mind. So I rang Gilston Road, by this time a little embarrassed, because I had to explain that the problem that I had been solved, well, not perhaps solved, still not solved, but had found another solution. And that, slightly casting around, I have to say, I said that I had another preoccupation, which was very real, about what to do with all the cars that belonged to the people who lived in the 6 or 7 houses on the in the stable yard. And Peter, very surprisingly and very charmingly, said, "Listen, of course I'll come down for a day and have a look." After lunch, we went out on a tour, which really lasted well into the evening. And the first lesson, which kind of I'd learned before he arrived, was this thing about the absolute priority of focus given to any architectural project once he'd embarked upon it. I mean, it was very, very single-minded, the pursuit, not sort of focused and grim, but just very clear what he was doing and where he was going. That's what architects did. They built projects. The second thing that I really learned that afternoon as we went round was the kind of formality and care that he gave to what one might call the kind of interrogation of the place. I mean, it was very considered, and I think it's worth saying that what he was interested in then, it seemed to me, was to do with space and an examination of the kind of architectonic qualities of the buildings, the trees, the landscape. He was wholly uninterested in, as it seemed to me, and I think this is probably right, in my kind of social program. I talked to him about community and so on, in terms of the estate, and I tried to explain how it worked, to which he said, "Listen, it's just a big playpen," and that was the basis on which we went forward. After breakfast the next day, he left. But he first took me to see this chestnut tree, which he'd found the day before, and said, "You know, this is really much, much, much better than any building that you've got." He didn't pronounce on any architectural issue, but he said also that on his walk around, at some point when I hadn't been there, he'd found a modern barn that I'd built, and that was clearly where I should put the cars. And he said that his view had always been that people were happy as long as that they felt that their cars were respected and comfortable, and that if I made a nice place for them, people would behave, and sort of that was it. But he said he had the place in his head. He wanted to think about it more, and then very sweetly, in a way, he said that this is a very kind of English joke, but he said that he wanted. Could I be sure that the volume of Just William stories that he'd been reading in his bedroom was still in his bedroom the next time that he came? So in a way, I was being told that I had that he was interested, but not told what. He came back in the summer, and it was as I felt, it was purely a social visit. But he was carrying this tube, this very, very tube. And before we put the lights down, I struggled really to remember what he said, but really the gist of it was that he thought a lot about the landscape, and he wondered if I would consider building this tower, which I don't know if anybody can see it, but which he and Alison had designed in its original version. In 1984, I mean a long time before, for a site in Siena. It was done very, very charmingly in a way that would have completely allowed me to let it pass. I mean, I could have simply not responded. But it was impossible not to feel that he thought about it a lot. Three things kind of occurred to me then and later. The first was that this is what he was interested in building. And he was really telling me that he wasn't anxious to get involved, I think very reasonably in retrospect, in anything else. The second part of it was that there was a kind of pragmatism about the proposal. That is, he thought quite a lot about it. He thought, what can I propose that would interest both him and me to build? You know, it was sort of very clear. And the third thing, which really only emerged over time and was actually the most surprising, was that he really loved the landscape. I mean, he was really passionate about English landscape specifically, not this particular landscape, but he really wanted to make some sort of mark and contribution to it. And in fact, at one point, rather late in an evening, he said that what he was really about is giving this chestnut tree a run for its money. Immediately, there were lots of issues about material and construction. He didn't want to use the core 10 that was part of the original project in Italy, and he really disliked, this is a change, he really disliked for once the Colombian pine that I had found salvaged from the docks in Plymouth. But I'd got him, well, no, actually we both agreed a kind of general principle that I was following of sourcing materials and labor close to the, as close to the estate as possible. But I didn't have enough cut and dried oak of the right dimensions, and the timber framing company who we had been talking to, who were very close by, finally persuaded us that we could use green oak. It was actually, in its way, an extraordinary idea, given how unstable the structure was intrinsically. And then I remember Peter being very, very pleased when we went out together and marked the trees that we were going to cut, and I was able to identify exactly when they had been planted and by which of my relations in the 1830s. So I mean, it was all, there was a lot of engagement. This wasn't the end of the story. What seems like, really does seem like a relatively simple construction, became enormously complicated in oak, and these engineering problems came in wave after wave after wave. Firstly, I just thought I'd show you this drawing because this is our wind shear drawing, and I mean, in fact, it just produced this rather charming image, but it was a big problem because of the weight of the tower and the amount of face that it presented to the wind. Then we realized that the structure demanded very precisely located and rigid joints. At one point there were 4 oak members that came together in 3 different planes, and there just wasn't the thickness in the oak to accommodate the jointing. I'll show you. Oh, wrong one. I have to go on there. How do I go back? Oh, well, I've missed one. I'm sorry. So we ended up actually making models in, I think, 5 different scales for the carpenters to understand the the kind of geometry of what they were doing. The other problem was that we had to aim off for the tendency of the green wood to twist even after we cut it. I mean, you can be quite clever about the way you take the wood out of the trunk, but it still has a tendency to move, and we needed to kind of lock it into place. And then the final blow was the very dour Scottish engineer saying to me that the structure itself, this kind of ascending spiral with a plan that enlarged as it went up and then kept returning on itself in very, very acute angles, was the only building he'd ever worked on which was determined to push itself over. I mean, it was it went beyond simple engineering. We resolved this eventually by inserting stainless steel box into the most complicated joints, and then binding the whole structure in stainless steel ribbon, which as you can see, fitted into that groove that we made. I have to say I was rather nervous of putting to Peter this idea, this kind of radical departure from functionalist principle. Peter remained completely calm, and he said that my steel insertions simply reminded him of the steel pins that were in his leg after he broke it. So in a way, it's another story about getting something built, I think. We built it in the barn, which Peter had earmarked for the cars. The cars have still not arrived there. And over the 8 or 10 weeks, Peter came down week after week, really engaged with the carpenters, worked to understand their problems. We sent soup out to him because he was so determined to keep going. There's another, if it worked, another good photograph of him examining the construction. But it really the construction became much more his project. It was him and the carpenters, actually, as much as anything to do with me. In the meantime, there had been a kind of parallel, equally complicated exercise in terms of locating the site. The original version of the tower had been designed for Siena in '84, and it couldn't have been more different, just to give you an idea. The tower, you see, is at the top. It marked, in Peter's description, the point in a curving, descending street between two 18th century buildings, both of which were part of a hospital site that was going to be converted to new use. And the tower itself marked the point where steps, between the two buildings, where steps descended to a small piazza. So you actually passed under the tower. And it projected, as you see, well above the roofs in Siena, to show, as he said, that something had changed in relation to the hospital building for anybody who came into the town. From the start, we were, both of us, very doubtful about a location that referred to the formal elements in the landscape. I had a 17th century avenue, I mean, twice replanted, but 17th century avenue on axis with the main house, and we were neither of us convinced by that. But then emerged, quite, for me, rather an interesting difference in approach. I saw the asymmetry of the tower as something that compelled, if you like, one to move round it in the landscape. A kind of proactive folly, if you like. Peter had a very, very much stronger idea, which I think survived from Siena, and that was that properly positioned, it would make the landscape move around it. I mean, it was much, much more ambitious in a sense. He was quite critical of my approach, and he said that he quite sensibly pointed out that there was no perfect resolution possible on my view, because wherever you put it was always going to be informed by where you saw it from first and how you moved towards it. And it's true that I kept taking him out to show him new locations, possible new locations that excited me. But the problem was that that immediately ruled out other locations that had been just as exciting. So in a way I learned something, which is that however informal a landscape, and this was a landscape that had been built really in the 18th century, but however informal, late 18th century, however informal such a landscape is, there is this element of artificiality and informality about it. Peter wasn't, in any case, a bit interested in this sort of picturesque approach, and that actually is. Let's just show you how we worked. This is a scaffolding tower that we put up to try and identify where the site would work best. At a certain point we got frustrated by this, and I sent my children out with a helium balloon and 3 strings, and they moved around the park on instructions from mobile telephones. The tower went up, came down a bit, went up again, ended up more or less the height of the original. And then we started to experiment with the orientation of the spiral, whether it was to open towards the landscape or towards the woodland, or whether we set it obliquely. And finally we did find a location which is more or less where that pole is, but it involved Peter said it involved my bulldozing most of the pond that you see in front of it. I mean, I had my doubts about the pond anyway, but it generated another 4 or 5 months of delay because I had to do something with the water, bulldoze the pond, do something with the water, re-sow it. And Peter wasn't really prepared to commit himself on the site until the grass had grown again. So the process went on and on. Finally, we had it as we thought all right, and we went out with just he and I. We'd had sort of an awful lot of other people interfering. He and I went out with a hay bale, which we dragged a few meters this way, a few meters that way, and I think it was by then we were all quite exhausted, and Peter said, listen, let's just build it here and see how the landscape changes its surroundings. And he said, listen, you can always plant some more trees around it. And when I said, listen, it's going to take 120 years for the beech trees to get as high as the tower, he just shrugged. It was as though that was going to be posterity's problem, not his, in a way. It was also very clear that the tower was still going to be there in 120 years, so, that was it. There were no, but in this process, which I hope I've described accurately, there were no corners to cut. It was all driven by doing it right. I kept getting messages from Canada that I was sort of testing Peter's longevity, but right at the end, he insisted on coming down again to check the screw heads that we had selected, in spite of the fact that, as I pointed out to him, the locations of the screw heads were going to be invisible to any human eye within 3 weeks of by the time we put it up. Eventually, we wheeled it out like that on this carriage that we had made, and then put it up rather theatrically, as theatrically in a way as possible, with 2 cranes in the park. At the end, there had been a rather wholly fortuitous triumph, because I had finally rung with a definitive date for this ceremony, and there was one of those very, very long silences, which I think we probably all know. They're particularly unnerving on the telephone. And finally he said, very touchingly, you know, that's Alison's birthday. So, you know, we got it up on the right day. After it was up, we were, I mean, I'm just going to show you some slides quickly of it from different angles. But I think we were both of us worried that it was too static and monumental where it stood, and he wanted to come down again this spring to see how it had weathered a completely different colour. And I think he was also very interested in how it was going to relate to the tree trunks with their leaves off. But I think it's really the last thing I want to say, which was that implicit in all of those discussions was, I'll show you, that's a better photograph of the weathering, was the idea that it was still an ongoing thing, and that probably sooner or later we would persuade each other to move it a little bit up the hill against the trees or a little bit further away from the house. There we are.